Okay, we're going to try to finish up Jamestown this time. We'll call it Part 7, English Colonization Part 7. Um, First of all, before I dig into this or get back into it, this is kind of by way of an announcement, something I'm adding. Should have thought of it sooner. I think it'll enrich the course quite a bit. Under each weekly assignments module, you'll find a bunch of items, a selection of items I've labeled extra stuff. I did quite a few added to um, the first week, which by the time you see this will be last week. Some of them are longer than others, but I think it adds a lot of perspective. The people who do those, and that they're fairly expensive to produce. They can put in pictures and motion and all of that. That I, being just a beginner and not able to pay a bunch of royalties for copyrighted stuff, can't really do. Sometimes they'll contradict me. Flip a coin. There's one about the Columbian Exchange, which is very, very informative, except the person presenting it ends up, I guess, feeling obliged to cast it in a negative light. There's That's just the culture now among academics. Everything about the West, meaning America, even Western Europe, it has to be put out in a negative light. So make up your own mind about that. He makes allegations about species vanishing and so forth. Look, there's no way to know that. What's that based on? The desire to make it all look negative? Hard to say. Okay, we left off getting Virginia up and running. We told you about I think we left off with the House of Burgesses. There are two or three more things I want to tell you about that. Representation, political representation from day one did not work the same in Virginia and the rest of the colonies later as it did in England. All right? In America, if you are representing one of these so-called plantations, and there's one of them in there, the only way we know it ever existed was it's mentioned they didn't find the ruins till the 70s, got wiped out by the Indians. Anyway, a couple of assumptions. One, you had to be a resident. It's not a rule, it's just a practice, a resident of that place to be eligible to serve as a delegate. The other thing is the only people you represent are the people in that place, not somebody else in some other place. Um, and you act as their agent. I guess that makes it three. Now, says, well, what's different about that? Well, nothing, actually. That's the way it's worked in America ever since. The thing is, that's not how it worked in England. Now, the House of Burgesses is obviously modeled on the House of Commons in England, where each shire or county can elect two delegates. Each chartered borough, that would be a town with a royal charter granting it the right to do so, can elect two delegates. If you own land enough places, you could vote in as many places you could get to. Uh, and by the 18th century, sometime later, um, a delegate, a member of the House of Commons, did not have to come from that place. Quite often, they just had to find somebody who could afford to do the job, because members of the House of Commons did not get paid until the year 1911. Now, when people in legislative bodies get paid little, like in Texas, or nothing, that effectively filters out regular people who have to have jobs from doing that job. Okay, so they're gonna sometimes they just sell. They've got two things here. They sell them to the highest bidder, somebody from some other place, and a member of the House of Commons does not see himself as acting as the agent of the place, people in the place that elected him. Their idea, and they didn't cook this up, we challenged them in the 1760s, it's called virtual representation. Every member of the House of Commons represented all Englishmen everywhere. What brings that up? Nobody realizes that representation is coming to mean a different thing here until the 1760s, when the British government, very cash strapped after a very expensive war where they'd cleaned everybody's clock and got to be the number one power, their empire suddenly grown much more expensive, as we'll see in the next unit. They think we ought to pay our way. We'd not been paying any taxes directly into the royal treasury. So they began attempting to tax us without our consent. We resisted that on the grounds that since we were not represented in the House of Commons, it therefore had no authority to tax us. Okay? They replied, and this conversation really did take place as ships crossed the Atlantic, that of course we're represented in the House of Commons. Each member represents all Englishmen everywhere, and that certainly includes us. And we're not having any of that. Our reply to that was, wait a minute, you don't understand. We didn't get to vote on any of those guys, and none of those guys came from here. So therefore, we're not represented. They had an answer for that too. Okay, as I just said. Well, we'll take it to the numbers. No more than 20% of the adult males in England was eligible to vote in a parliamentary election, and the members could come from anywhere and didn't see themselves as agents. So then women couldn't vote. So if 90% of the population is considered to be represented by these people, when that 90% had no choice in who they were or anything like that, where did we get off saying we're not represented? There's not a way to fix that. You cannot compromise your way out of that. So push comes to shove, we're either going to have to take a knee and submit or fight back. You can guess what we did. So every colony ends up with a representative assembly of some kind. We'll cover that later in the unit under colonial government. All right, two more things associated with 1619. I'll get to the one you're thinking about last. The next one, if I were outlining this on the board, I would just put the word women. As late as 1619, very few English women had come to Virginia. The number's not zero. We have a record of the names of passengers who arrived on a ship as far back as 1608. There are two female names. One of those names continues to occur in the records for several more years. She married, lived out what was in a normal lifespan. The other name never appears again. Presumably what happened to that unfortunate woman was what happened to most of the men. She got sick and died. So few English women were coming that men who felt they had to marry had no choice but to do what John Rolfe did and marry among the Indians. Okay, along about 1619, a practice began to emerge that I'm going to tell you about. First, I want to say, ladies, try to imagine how desperate you would have to be before this starts to sound like a good idea. Okay, here's the deal. Young single women, almost certainly of the economic refugee category, who have no hope of a husband or a family life or anything like that in England, could, if circumstances worked out, accept a no out-of-pocket expense boat ride to Virginia. It costs money to bring them over, so when the ship gets to Virginia with some of these women aboard, whatever man shows up with the money that it costs to bring you over here and pays the captain the money, pick you out of the lineup and take you home, and you're going to be his wife, and he's going to be your husband. Okay? I suspect those marriages worked out about as well as some marriages do now. And let's face it, it wasn't all necessarily bad. Some of these women hit the lottery. They were selected by, honest men who were good husbands, good providers, good protectors, hardworking men who rose in society. You start out as this hungry waif in England, you end up a member of high society in America. There's no possibility of that in England. Still, it took until the 60s. Now, this resembles indentured servant, but obvious differences. It's not till the 1640s that there's a normal gender ratio in the general population. It's not for 30 more years after that, the 1670s, before even a bare majority of the English in Virginia had actually been born there. Until then, the death rate is so high, the population is supported by immigration more than it was by biological increase. Okay. The last one is the one that rang your bell when I said 1619, and we're going to delicately call it African servitude or black servitude. I'm talking about slavery. Okay, there's a lot we don't know about the details here. First, slavery's been around a long, long time. It was everywhere in the ancient world, up through, say, the fall of the Roman Empire. And in the ancient world, it was not race-based. Anyone could become a slave. Anyone could have been a slave. And the laws in the Roman Empire recognized slaves as human beings. Consequently, Spanish colonies in America, since they were all Roman Catholics, and since Roman Catholic Church law feeds off ancient Roman law, they recognized slaves as human beings, although far fewer, over 90% of the people brought from Africa ended up in the Hispanic colonies. Far fewer of them survived, but they're recognized as human beings. In America, in English America, slaves had a far more perilous legal status, but they remain numerous. Okay. We'll deal with slavery in a separate connection later on, but what connects us to 1619 is that there's a letter written by John Rolfe, which survives from that year. And in this letter he states, quote, "Today a Dutch ship arrived and sold us 20 Negroes." All right. Turns out it was an English ship flying a Dutch flag. There's other stories about it. I have no idea how they know that they're true. But what do we know? We know that that is the earliest document mentioning black servitude in English America. Do we know that those are the first Africans to be brought here? We do not know that. There could have been others sooner who we just don't know about because there aren't any documents. Do we know, this will surprise you, do we know that they were actually sold as slaves? We don't know that either. Now, slavery in Europe, very much including Britain, had pretty well died out, been discontinued at the end of the ancient world. So between the ancient world and the modern world, that's a period of about a millennium, around 500 AD to around 1500 AD, actual what's called chattel slavery, where your body belongs as property to another person. They had other forms of servitude, but it wasn't that. So in England, slavery had been gone for like 1,000 years. It's considered possible, very possible, that these Englishmen fell back on forms of labor that they were accustomed to, and that these slaves were served. I said slaves. These Africans were sold as contract laborers, indentured servants. We do know that some Africans were indentured servants, served out their indentures and became free. There were free black people in Virginia as early as 1630, and even on the eve of the Civil War in 1860, about 10% of all African Americans were free. Some of them were wealthy and owned slaves, mainly in northern Louisiana and eastern Texas. So when we'll pick this up later, we'll see that whatever it was to start with, it became slavery all too soon. There's been controversy lately about something that was ginned up by the New York Times and won a Pulitzer, called the 1619 Project, and it blithely assumes that 1619 the first Africans were brought and they were slaves. Remember, we don't know either of those things. And that the number one fact, crowding everything else out about America, has been slavery. That nothing else matters. And no allowance for different cultures with different values. And it's all, to me, it's all too extreme, too unforgiving, too inflexible. History, the past is not like that. If you could travel back through time 175 years and witness slavery, it would not satisfy you. It would not, I suspect, be as bad as some people assume it was. It would not be as benign as other people thought it was. I'm not saying it should have been kept around. I'm just saying that it's being used as a kind of blame-shifting mechanism. So, I see I've used up just over 14 and a half minutes, and we'll actually technically finish Jamestown in part 8 coming up. It won't take long.